Donald Trump is about to enter year 3 of his presidency, and here's how bad it is when compiled by one enterprising journalist. Wired magazine tallied up at least 17 distinct court cases stemming from at least 7 different sets of prosecutors and investigators. That does not include congressional inquiries. Our network is placing those cases under 6 broad categories of investigation: Russian interference in the 2016 campaign, including obstruction; hush money payments leading to campaign finance violations; inaugural committee spending; misuse of charity funds involving the Trump Foundation; foreign payments and the emoluments clause of the Constitution; allegations that Trump is accepting payments from foreign powers while in office; and a defamation lawsuit over a sexual assault claim. That is the case related to the accusations from a former Apprentice contestant. We've been left to read this story in progress as it's laid out in all the various charging documents, sentencing documents, especially those related to Michael Cohen. They all raise questions about whether Trump could eventually be indicted. As you may know, there is that Justice Department policy against indicting a sitting president. But the man who was formerly the top government lawyer before the Supreme Court, Neil Katyal, feels the Trump case could be so unique that rule may not apply.
There are memos that say a sitting president can't be indicted, but they're generic memos. They don't apply to a situation like this, in which the crime that's being alleged is one that allowed someone to get the presidency in the first place. You know, these are campaign contributions and hush money that very well could have swung the 2016 election. They may be considered the most significant campaign contributions in the history of the United States.
Notable words from the law professor. The president spent much of his weekend launching a combined online attack on Michael Cohen that included a broadside against federal investigators for good measure. Quote, "Remember, Michael Cohen only became a rat after the FBI did something which was absolutely unthinkable and unheard of until the witch hunt was illegally started. They broke into an attorney's office. Why didn't they break into the DNC to get the server or Crooked's office? For the record, it was an FBI raid to execute a federal warrant." Trump's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, also went after Cohen, slamming him for pleading guilty and talking to federal prosecutors in New York while also trying to defend his client, the president.
Southern District says you can get out of jail if you do this. He's got 3 years now. There's a real motivation to sing like crazy. He's got to do a lot of singing to get out of the 3 years. And he will say whatever he has to say. He's changed his story 4 or 5 times.
So is the president.
President's not under oath.
And will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend
The Constitution of the United States.
the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
That last part was just too easy. With us to talk about it tonight from Washington, Pulitzer Prize-winning White House bureau chief for the Washington Post, Philip Rucker. And here with us in New York, former Republican member of Congress from the great state of Florida, David Jolly. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. Phil, what must it be like? The question I ask you on a weekly, if not daily basis in the West Wing. Looming shutdown, let's not forget, at least in the president's mind. The ongoing Twitter war with elements of his own government, and now the economy, which is starting to pop up on the radars of a good many folks who, when they last checked, things were humming along.
Yeah, Brian, the gyrations in the stock market have President Trump especially worried these last few weeks because he knows that a good economy is going to be the key to his reelection in 2020. And if we are to head into a recession, as some economists suggest may be happening, that does not bode well for his political future. But look, Trump is also dealing with this cascade of legal investigations that are really quite perilous for him. And it goes beyond the Russia matter, as you laid out. Some of these investigations ensnare members of his family. His 3 eldest adult children, Ivanka, Don Jr., and Eric, are involved in some of these investigations. And they get to the president's business practices, his finances, which he has taken great pains to keep secret from the public by not releasing his tax returns. The businesses, of course, that's an issue that he felt was a red line for Mueller, but there are separate investigations into that. And it, signals, I think, that 2019 2018 is going to be the year of investigating this president, because the Democrats in the House are committed to doing so, not just about Russia, not just about the hush money, but they plan to try to subpoena his tax returns. They plan to try to investigate the emoluments clause and the corruption with his businesses. They also plan to investigate issues throughout the administration and some of these cabinet agencies.
Congressman, I have one more greatest hit to show you from America's former mayor. This is about a sliding scale, unknown to most of us, for payoff payments. We'll show it and talk about it on the other side.
The amount of money is consistent with harassment, not truth. I have been involved in cases like this. When it's true and you have the kind of money that the president had, it's $1 million settlement. When it's not true, when it's a harassment settlement and it's not true, you give them $130,000, $150,000. They went away for so little money that it indicates their case was very, very weak.
So you got your $1 million settlements over here, your 130s are over here. Would you like it if your lawyer was out talking that way?
Rudy Giuliani is a terrible lawyer right now. He really is. And listen, the reason he is flailing is because the president may not be under oath, but everybody who's testifying against the president is. From Michael Cohen to the prosecutors who have brought the charges that name the president as a conspirator in a federal felony, to the judge that has entered judgment regarding that underlying crime. But I think the reason you see Donald Trump flailing is for a man who thought he would be the 5th president on Mount Rushmore, he's more likely to be the 3rd president to be impeached. And the reason I mean that is Democrats are going to face a very tough issue. Donald Trump has been named in a criminal conspiracy in federal court, a criminal conspiracy that has been entered into judgment, accepted by a federal judge, that if the judge did not think there were merits to the charge and to the crime, would never have entered that. This is going to be a tough place for Democrats because they have to approach the fact that the President of the United States has been implicated in a federal crime. To do otherwise would be Congress abandoning its Article I authority within the Constitution. And I think a lot of the American people are going to say, Democrats, if you look the other way, what does that mean for presidential immunity going forward?
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.